I think the thing is that it's not just about being an architect. It's about, doing the type of work that inspires you. I think, it's the same thing in art, right? There are very different types of creativity and ways of being creative, but the medium and the method and all that has to be the right one. Otherwise, it just feels like motion, not like intention.
Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today we spoke with David Morris of Caleb Johnson Studio. It was an incredible conversation, as I knew it would be, because David is an extremely talented designer and a very interesting guy to talk to. So enjoy it, check it out. Thank you to our sponsors for this podcast today, Maine Home Design, and check out David Morris's design theory article in the next issue of Maine Home Design. David Morris, welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. How are you doing on this winter day?
I'm doing pretty great. It's it's been a couple of weeks of some cold and snowy weather, and I'm looking out of my dining room window right now at sun and 50 degrees. So
oh wow, it's 50 degrees in Maine right now. Jeez.
Yeah. I put a coat on this morning and went outside and decided I did not need it. So which is
Nice.
always a nice thing, but you do know that Maine winter is probably not done with us yet.
No, it's not till the second week in March where you start to get more consistent, like 50-degree days or 40-degree days, where you can like kind of back off of your fear of like having to put up with this for too much longer. So
yeah, and we try and get out of town once a month or so, typically during the winters. But over the past couple of years, that's not been happening so much. So I'm looking forward to getting away a little bit.
Nice. Yeah. So I was hoping we could do this in studio with you because I've somewhat worked with you in the past on our own residence and know your level of talent and everything else. But it just ended up I'm out in California right now and you're in Maine, wishing that you could maybe be here doing the podcast with me right now.
Yeah.
But it's really cool to have you on. I'd like to know more about, first of all, your background and what drew you to design-oriented income working environment. Like what's your background that made you realize that's what you wanted to do? But then
Sure.
Now that you're that, how do you keep the interest and the drive and everything else going to be fascinated by design, to the everyday kind of interaction that you do when you go to work? It
Sure.
becomes a job like anything else, but I found that successful designers usually have some passion that's a lot deeper, almost metaphysical kind of thing that they grab to that helps them understand more deeply everything that they're doing.
Yeah, I think I'll go way back. Ever since I was a little kid, being an architect was really the only path for me. Even though at the time
Wow.
I don't really think I knew what that meant. I remember my mom telling me one time, "Oh, you're going to be an architect," and that word was so foreign to me that I was like, "I don't know what that means. Don't tell me what I'm going to be."
Right.
But she was right, and I think the reason that she was right, and the reason that is that I was kind of I always had a pad and paper with me. I was always drawing. I was always kind of looking around and looking at my environment, and I was really fascinated with buildings. And I was I was kind of probably a really strange little kid because I was always fascinated with seeing the staircase in someone's house.
Yeah.
And I would have these visions of the way that people moved around and the way that people lived in buildings. And it was kind of strange as at an early age to be really fascinated by the way that people did that. Because for me, the houses of my families, meaning whether it's my grandparents' house or my parents' house or the houses of my friends, they were always such a big part of the experiences that I had as a small kid. So, and the way that we lived in them was always such a big part of my childhood that I was fascinated to think about how other people lived in houses. And I grew up in West Virginia, and to really good in a really good, safe community where, people were hardworking, but there wasn't a lot of extra. And so you see on TV all of these other things that existed in the world, and it just like kind of sparked my curiosity of, okay, well, how do people live elsewhere? And so I've always been really drawn to the kind of the experience of a building, and in particular a house. And it had less to do, I think, with the physical qualities of it, because one time when I was a kid, I would be interested in this, and then another time I would be interested in this. And so it had less to do with that, but it was always kind of the same thing of thinking about how people lived in their houses. And so and that kind of married with my love of drawing. And I had an aunt and uncle who were both professional artists, and they would just kind of help fuel that fire of allowing me to, to draw and paint and use their studios and really encourage me. And so I went to architecture school at the University of Tennessee. I did a 5-year degree, Bachelor of Architecture there. And then I moved to DC, Washington, DC, and went and worked on schools for 13 years.
Oh, wow.
And after 13 years, I was tired, I was burned out, and I worked for a great office. We did primarily buildings for private schools. So it could be a classroom building, it could be an art center. I did an indoor rowing tank for a school that supported crew. So we did really fun things, but after 13 years, I was like, what am I doing?
Was the commercial aspect of it just far more technical and more bureaucratic and wore you out?
It just wasn't in my soul. I mean, when I graduated college in 2002, it wasn't a really great time to be graduating. And so I knew I wanted to be in a city, and I found a great place to work.
The time frame when you graduated, the two worst professions to go into, because I graduated around the same time. Two worst professions were architecture and photography, supposedly.
Oh, so
we really nailed that one down.
Yeah, really. Well, but at the time, it really didn't matter to me, because I was like, I've just come out of architecture school, which is 5 years of really tough work, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
All I cared about really was moving to a city, getting a job, and starting, a life. A small kid from West Virginia, I wanted to see people and see other people and learn about new things and things like that. So DC was a great place for me to do that, and I learned so much in those 13 years. But I started just to really think about, like, I'm in my, at that point, I'm probably in my late 20s, early 30s. And I'm like, I'm burned out. I'm tired of being an architect. Like, I don't want to do this. And I realized really quickly, after I really started to think about it, it's just because the type of work I was doing didn't tie into anything about the way that I got to be an architect. Meaning
kind of your passion from childhood, essentially.
Yeah. Like I kind of ignored that in the name of having a really good, steady job, and I got to do good work and work with people who taught me a lot. But I think the thing is that it's not just about being an architect. It's about, doing the type of work that inspires you. I think, the same thing in art, right? There are very different types of creativity and ways of being creative, but the medium and the method and all that has to be the right one. Otherwise, it just feels like motion, not like intention. So
right, there has to be some kind of deeper connective passion. It seems that it's always a thing that is not objectified, that you still have to subjectively experience and interpret to keep yourself engaged. Because if you turn into like a technician just kind of stamping things out, it becomes a loss of experience and more a regurgitation of bureaucratic ways of design solutions dealing with things, rather than here's a new creative problem and we get to find something new, a new way of doing this that engages your soul. Mind, soul, everything.
Yeah, otherwise it becomes painful, and people always say, life is too short. And I always think, if you're not doing the things that you love, and if you're not engaged with people and places and activities that you love, life is actually not short. Life is really long. And it's like that drive to the beach, right? Like that 8-hour drive that we would take as a kid to Myrtle Beach. I was like, oh man, this is the longest time in the world. And it was because of it just, when you're not engaged with the world, life is long, and life speeds up when you're having fun.
Right.
That week at the beach flew by, and like quicker than the drive down there. And it's because of the joy that's experienced doing the thing that you love.
Right.
And so, I look back, I've been in Maine now I'm in my 7th year. I came from DC. And I look back and I think like the past 7 years have been so fast. Like they have just been, I feel like we moved here yesterday.
Wow.
But we haven't. And I think a lot
now,
of it has
both you and your partner relocated from Maine?
We did. So
or relocated from DC, sorry.
From DC. So I left the first office that I worked for and went to work for a very small office. So I went from an office of 60 people to an office of like 4 people. And we primarily did residential work on historic houses in DC, which was awesome. It was great. But I got really fatigued with living in DC. It's a great city to be young, and it's a great city to explore life and figure out who you are, and to make friends and live that. But at a certain point, it also is the kind of city where you just start to get really tired. And I just got really tired of living there. I wanted to be near the water. I wanted to be near fresh air. And so I told my partner, Justin, I said, we're going to move to Maine. And he was like, no, we're not.
So without a job, without anything, you're like, we're moving to Maine.
Yeah, I had never even been to Maine. I'd never been to Maine.
Why did you pick Maine?
Okay, so this is funny.
Represent. I mean, come on.
There you go. I almost wore my Maine hat today, but I was like, is that going to be too commercial? But
never too cheesy on this podcast. Come on.
Well, I was like, here's another fun fact about me as a kid. I loved the show Murder, She Wrote. And
I used to watch that with my mom.
Murder, She Wrote took place in Cabot Cove, Maine, which turned out to be
I
like
didn't know that was
capital.
Maine.
Yeah, it was Maine, although it was filmed in California, probably not far from where you are.
Oh, I bet, like just up north here, yeah.
So I had this very romantic attachment here again of Maine from childhood, and I remember watching Murder, She Wrote with my grandmother and my sister, and so I said, we're moving to Maine, and he was from New Hampshire, and so he was like, no, we're not moving to Maine. People from New Hampshire don't move to Maine.
Now,
I said,
Justin's from New Hampshire?
He's from New Hampshire.
So he knows the stereotype of Mainers, and he was like, I'm not going there.
Yeah. He was like, I'm not doing it. And at the time he worked at the time he worked for he was deputy chief of staff for Senator Gene Shaheen from New Hampshire. And it was kind of his dream job. And so when I said, we're moving to Maine, he said, no way. And we came to visit Maine after one of the election cycles, and we both really liked it. And we talked about it for months and months and months. And I finally said, well, are we going to do this or not? Because I'm tired of talking about it. And he said, well, I don't see you looking for a job. And I was like, okay, well, challenge accepted. And within 8 weeks, I was at Caleb's office. So, nice. And he he followed 3 or 4 months after me, but that was 7 years ago.
And I'm good friends with Caleb. So behind the scenes, I remember him hiring you. And when he was thinking about hiring you, he was like, oh, I found this guy, so talented. He was, really excited to be pulling in someone, attracting like real talent, to Maine like that. That's at the time, it was like, if you're pulling people from a place like New York or DC to come to Maine, it was like, I did it. I got someone, so that's pretty cool.
And I also think people from cities choose to move here, right? I wasn't moving here because I needed a job or because I was actually complicating my life by doing it, but it was this choice. And so I was going to be very specific about who I worked with and the type of work I wanted to do. And so it was just pretty fortuitous that he was looking at the time, and it happened to be that he was going to be in New York City visiting some friends, and he said, well, why don't you come up to New York one night and we'll chat. And so I called my friends in New York and said, I'm coming up, I need a place to stay. And so he and I first had our first conversation in a hotel lobby in New York City. And it's been, I mean, Caleb and I are, I think, a really interesting pair because we don't think everything similarly, but we have a lot of really, many of our core kind of principles and the way we think about things are very much the same. So while we may make different decisions and based on that, they're almost always grounded in the same kind of
principles.
So you can respect someone's decision, even if it's not the decision you would have made, because you can understand and see the kind of foundation that it's resting on.
Yeah. So two points there. First one, I'll make the point. You come back to them, but I forget things if I don't get them out quick.
No.
Have you found a place in Maine that represents Cabot Cove to you? Like the most idyllic stereotype that you had in your head of Maine. Have you found like that little quaint place? And it's such an incredible value to have someone on your team that thinks differently. And that I've realized this from having to live with the person I chose to marry.
Yeah.
She's completely sees the world differently than me. But I've found that if you put aside the frustration and just absolute hatred that you can develop for that person because they think differently at times, like if you can realize this person has your back, if you'll allow them to, they just simply, they posture and see the world in a very beneficial way if you're working together and you value their perspective and your perspective. And that's very interesting that you can say that about Caleb, that you see things differently, but you have similar principles that create an end result that has a broader perspective, which is very wise. So those two comments, what do you got for me?
Okay, so I think the thing about Caleb and I is like there'd be no way for us to have completely aligned points of view because our backgrounds and our experiences have been so different. And I think that there's probably certainly times where he looks at things that I've done and he's like, oh, like, why did he do this? But the relationship, which has gone beyond just kind of like working together, and there's just, I think there's a lot of respect in the different experiences and that allow those kind of differences in points of view to be respected.
Sure.
I think when it comes to Cabot Cove, oddly enough, I've been here for 7 years, and this is going to sound like I'm complaining, and I'm totally not, because we haven't explored as much as I would like because we still have so many people that love to come and visit. And
that's so true, especially after the last 2 years.
Yes. And I will like during the summer, or, I have a friend staying with us right now. I'll never complain about it because there will come a time when people don't want to come visit. And as long as people want to visit, I'm going to take them up on it. Right. But it has prevented us probably from exploring Maine to the extent that we would like. But every summer our friends have a boat, and every summer we take whether it be a weekend or this year we went on their boat for 8 days, and we go up the coast.
Where at?
So we've gone as far. I mean, some of the islands that we've been to have been like some of the places that we really love are like the White Islands off the southern coast of, I think it's Vinyl Haven. We went to Castine last year. We went to McGlarrity in the Merchant Row. One of my favorite places is Valley Cove, which is up in Somme Sound, just north of Southwest Harbor. But we always kind of spend 3 or 4 days in Camden. And it's just such a lovely place. I think, I've become one of those people that are like, oh, there's too many tourists here. I've become one of those people that complain about traffic and tourists. But it does have this kind of really charming feel that I love. And there are so many other places that, like, I went to Castine last year for the first time, and I thought that was just really charming. I mean,
Oh yeah.
we've done work on a bunch of the islands up near Mount Desert, and there's so many places that you see. And what I like about it is that they all have just a slightly different flavor, but there's a real consistency too. So
Just the difference between Vinyl Haven and North Haven. Vinyl Haven was like the fishing island, and it actually has a higher crime rate. And I imagine that's just because going out on a boat and fishing is a more agitating way to make a living. And so your just trickle down effect is that you have some grumpy people off and on.
Yeah.
But then North Haven was more like the farming island. And it's very interesting to see how that translates into their like built environment and just the geography,
the culture,
how that it's really a neat thing to see, like in a state, like there's just that diversity just because of islands and their own geography. That's always fascinated me.
Yeah, I mean, Maine is like that. I mean, I like I said, I haven't explored it as much as I would like, but you even go inland and it's very different, right?
Oh yeah.
It's just such a a vast place that has both mountains and water and field and rural, and
it's so pretty when you get like to Farmington area and there's these big, farming fields that are just like not something you find a lot of. It's in a river drainage kind of area, so there's more plains and everything, but then it's right next to the mountains, and that whole feeling there is just completely different than being next to the ocean and all the coastal culture there. And it's really so nice to just within 45 minutes to an hour have that different feel. You don't get that on the East Coast hardly at all, except in New England. So
no, you don't, because and I always tell people that, because I always thought Maine was a small state. I was like, oh, Maine's a small state, but Maine's a big state. There is a lot.
It's only small in population size.
Yeah, but for someone who grew up in the South, you think Maine is just like it's little. And so when I moved here, I had no idea that Portland was literally just like the first half of a fingernail into the state of Maine. But it's what actually made it really appealing to us, because Justin, my partner Justin, is a very, very much accomplished swimmer, and open water swimmer. And so we decided that we wanted to be near the water. If we were to leave DC, we were going to be near water. I grew up skiing, so I wanted to have the opportunity to ski. I haven't skied yet since I've been here. Justin will not ski, so
shout out snowshoe, right?
Snowshoe, right?
I used to ski there as a kid growing up. I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley, and my dad would take me up to Snowshoe. I think that's the only one we'd go to in West Virginia. That was like
Silver
the big
Creek
resort.
Was right next. Yeah. Well, have you been there lately? It is completely different.
Oh no.
I mean,
really?
It is so crazy developed, the top of the mountain.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's pretty remarkable what they've done. So I probably wouldn't even recognize it since the last time I had been there. But yeah, it's a great place. I mean, you can do things outdoors all year long here. And where we live in Cape Elizabeth, and we're not on the water, but we're not far. And so every day after work, we make a point to our best we can to walk and to see the water, because it just has this rejuvenate. I mean, you're sitting there looking at the ocean right now, and
it's hard to find me anywhere more than 10 miles from the ocean, no matter what.
Yeah,
I don't know. There's something about water and the transfer of energy in water and how much we're made of, something that you can't really describe. That's just really amazing about
it's life
being on the water. Yeah.
I mean, you can even see something. we have this painting. We found this painting of by a woman named Frances Flanagan, and we found it at a gallery in New Hampshire, but it's of the Maine coast. And so we're not on the water, but we say that this is the closest we can get right now.
Nice. So, in preparation for trying to get deep in one of these podcasts, I was reading this morning just like 2 paragraphs. I have this book on the history of philosophy, and I can really read about a paragraph at a time, and then I have to sit on it for like a week. And it was talking about Aristotle's philosophy and how he had this idea that nature uses the kind of, I'm going to butcher this, but basically the development of form that matter takes. So nature shapes matter into form to accommodate reality, or the truth of our reality, which is a really kind of interesting way of thinking about, like, yeah, we, if you take the evolutionary view, over billions of years, everything that was formed by the natural process of things coming into a form, being the amount of digits or length of arms or ability to breathe or whatever. It was all formed, and we get this visual spatial representation of what matter turns into after being worked on by just reality over time to turn into everything that is. And I thought that was a pretty interesting take on it, to say that we're the result of matter being encapsulated within this skin biological suit. Like, there's this idea of life evolving to this, and we're a representation of that. But how does that transfer into, okay, we've received this body and everything that we see in art over time, now we turn it into making something in the built environment, so how do you look at problems and the reality of everything around you and the complexity of the issues that clients bring to you, and shape that into space? Like, what's your belief on that, and how do you approach it?
Well, I can understand now why you would only be able to read a paragraph at a time, because that's
it's a weird concept to get a hold of, but once you do, you kind of realize, like, all right, we're kind of, like, depending on which belief system you're talking to, if it's a scientific or religious or spiritual, like, we're formed into being this by processes that work outside of us to form us into what we currently are. How do we do that when we are, designing and making things as well?
Well, I think it's interesting, because I think if we look at it from a and I've lost you. Oh, there you are.
There we are. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. I think you can look at it like on the way that I would say I approach my views on not just architecture, but I'll talk about it in terms of architecture right now, is that if you could take that same philosophy and that same principle and look at it in lots of different scales, and actually different ways of whether you're thinking at it from a very kind of philosophical, theoretical look, or you're thinking of it from like a proxemics and mechanical look. There are different ways of doing that. If I'm not having heard this just a couple minutes ago, what I would say is that, when we approach, or when I approach a design challenge that a client's giving us, they come to us and here they've given us what they want us to do, and I look at it, and I look at the way that if we take it out of sight of ourselves and we look at just the physical environment in which we live, has also been shaped by weather and by moving and by heat and cold and plates coming together and things breaking apart and wind, and that creates an environment now that we have inherited. And for me, that is certainly the most driving factor when I look at how I'm going to consider designing a building. The curve of a hill that has been shaped by wind, or the cragginess of a slope where erosion has broken it away, or whatever it may be, that certainly on a kind of a real, just kind of a surface level, is super informative. I mean, and I think people always ask me, what is the most important thing to you when you're designing a building? And I probably shock people a lot by saying, obviously, it's the landscape that is by far the most important thing that we do, because people come and go and families, change and things. But what doesn't change is the land that it sits on. And people get really upset when I say, my own aspirations and my clients' aspirations may be a bit farther down the list than what they would like to hear.
Right.
But if I take your comment now and say, okay, the landscape aside, that being the most important aspect, and you turn it into like kind of a theoretical conversation about, okay, how do people interact with one another? So we're not just we've got cells and atoms inside of us, and we're a group of organs walking around encased in our skin. But if you think about a building, it's kind of a similar thing, right? So there's this building is this
organism.
Is this organism that we are parts of inside. And there are ways that we can positively influence the health of that building and the health of the organs inside it. And there are ways that we can negatively impact that. And I don't really know where I'm going with this, but I do know that we think a lot about the experience of people. And I think a lot about the experience of people as it relates to my own interpretation of how I want to interact with people and what I think and how I want to interact with the outside world. And so what can we do as architects and designers and creative people to help that, to make that as healthy of an environment as possible? And it's I don't know the answer to it, but I do think that a building is very analogous to a body. And I tend to think that we're better when our bodies are working closely together, and people, I tend to believe, work better when they have positive engagement with other people. And so I focus a lot on making sure that a house is certainly, and a home is certainly, something that provides escape for people, but it should be also about a communal health and a communal living, whether it's 2 people or 6 people. And how do we do that? And I think that differs quite a bit on each project, but and I'm rambling, I guess, but I kind of think of that a little bit.
No, that's for me, when I look at like what I want out of a conversation, this is great, because you're kind of honestly kind of wandering through the thoughts that actually go through your head, which are really, really interesting and honest and important, I think. And I think that's a great point, that, if you look at us, we're formed, the way we look, the way we can function is first like this exterior, you get a form that responds to your environment over time, from everything from the shade of your skin to your height, or your ability for your extremities to not freeze. Like, you look at indigenous populations and everything else, and they have a response to the environment that they are native to, that in the modern age we've moved out of that and we're all over the place. And over time, I don't know what that effect will be.
It's interesting to think about. I've thought about that too.
Oh yeah, I mean, we're acclimated to our environment over just a huge stretch of time, in my opinion. And to see that, all right, we're formed in that way, but then we're formed also in a social way. And if you take a building, like you're saying, it takes cues from the natural environment that I think we bring into our cognitive experience to understand that that's happened to us. So that's the way that we should also think of forming the things that we create. So we take this exterior presentation, and it should take a reference from where it's going to be, from the location, the landscape and everything else. But then how the thing actually works inside, like a human has organs and a thought process and everything else, and how that works, how it accommodates all those things working together, is just a very interesting. I mean, like you look at Boston Dynamic robots, they're 100% looking at how biological diversity works best, and they're simply saying this process has worked over eons to create this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't we mimicking that within robotics to say this has been trialed back and forth over just millennia, so this might be the actual thing that works best, let's mimic that. And so we mimic that in the design process and everything else that really gives us this interesting reflection of experience limited by truth or formed by truth. That idea that there are laws and reality that is undeniable outside of our experience. So that's where I kind of start to push back against like a postmodernist, everything is open to just your own personal interpretation. I definitely believe that there's a degree of interpretation that we have to do that continues to create and evolve and progress this existence. But there is also, I think, metaphysical foundational truths that are undeniable, and that accommodation of those within long spans of time and shorter spans of time of how you apply them is really important. And I think how you're taking your experience and then applying that to the design process is exactly, in my opinion, exactly how nature works. It takes a reference from experience and applies it to a current problem.
And things that don't work tend to die, right? I mean,
yeah, or get torn down and
or
renovated,
get torn down, right? I mean, so it's interesting. We often talk about people want to know about architectural style, and they also they want to talk about, well, what style of building do you design? And I don't really care about any of that, because to me, that is putting a picture on something rather than understanding of connectivity, of operation, of function, of mechanics, of soul, because
that's kind of like taking a rigid ideology and applying it to how you live and saying, like, I live this way, and then you have to live that way, and you have to live that. And every time we see a rigid ideology, it just looks like either a despot, dictator, an oppressive regime, or a cult. That idea of like, there's one ideology and we're going to apply it across everybody doesn't work.
It doesn't work. And so I think it goes into what you're saying is like, you have to be informed by so many other things and external things. And from that, what will emerge is probably the more pure or more true form of what should be. And if you throw out the notion that you are going to make all of this work into your prescribed box, you're going to miss out on something good, and probably something you're going to probably miss on something that is enduring. We've been talking a lot about the word enduring in our office as a group, and what does the word enduring mean? And I think it all goes to that. I mean, you talk about nature and what you're talking about, things that occur over a long time, and those are the types of goals and aspirations that in my mind are really interesting, and that transcends architectural style. That transcends even me or you or whomever. It's because if something is enduring, then it lasts longer than all of us.
Right. There's this idea of sustainability within beauty. Then I think, I've always heard it said like there's truth within beauty, but I never really experientially understood how beauty connected to truth. But in really digging into a more philosophical view of reality, I can start to see that when you respond to things being seen as beautiful, when you see them as a result of emerging out of the restraints of reality, the best solution coming from reality will always be fairly well perceived as a visually pleasing thing if you take the right perspective on it. But that is still such a subjective comment that it's hard to really stand on it.
Well, but it's so funny that you brought that up, because it was, as I've been thinking a lot, I was a little nervous to do this. I was like a little nervous to talk about this, because
I knew you'd be great.
I'm not the greatest conversationalist, but I've been thinking a lot about the word beauty recently, because I think as well, I have lots of feelings about the word beauty, but I think you're right. Like, and when I think of things that are beautiful, like when I look at my phone and the pictures of things that I take, the photos that I take of things I experience are often like, one of the things that I love is walking on Scarborough Beach, and when the tide's running out and the way that the water has shifted the sand into these really serpentine kind of channels, like that's informed by nature. That's water doing something, but it's creating this incredibly beautiful form. And
right.
and there, you can see it anywhere. Like I mean, just even in the way that the snow is melting outside my house, like I can see these incredibly beautiful things happening. And I believe that as architects, we've been sold the bill of sale that and I don't prescribe to it, that everything has to be without ornament and things, because I'm starting to get into the thought of like, okay, yes, something has to work, but like in order for it to like, and there's beauty in something working, right? There's a notion of like, a column does its job and that's beautiful, but why can't that column do its job and be beautiful in an inspiring way that feeds the soul? And so I'm really interested in that. And I think a lot of it is just in the fact that the world is not rigid. The world is an ever-changing place that moves. And I'll take a photo of the beach on one day and I'll go back the next day and the beach is completely different, right?
Right.
And so how can I start to, without being gratuitous or without being just shallow, increase beauty in buildings that I'm working on, and not just, oh, that's a beautiful building, but like how can the parts be truly beautiful? And
so an interesting thing that I've always kind of struggled with, that you pointed out, this idea of ornamentation beyond simply function, right? And as architects in the recent times, there's this push towards extreme minimalism and just super reduced down to elemental things, fine, and I gravitate towards that to a huge degree. But at the same time, I would admit that kind of thing is a response to culture of the time. And I imagine that the people who are successful in those, in creating that type of thing and bringing that into emerging as being a thing, were always going to be somewhat of minimalist as a personality or what they gravitate to. But the culture overall, I think, experiences things worldwide and nationally that probably make a response to different types of design. Like, so if a country's in turmoil or coming out of turmoil or on the downward side of success as a country, I imagine there's probably responses to different things. If you look at like the design, if you will, of religions as they evolve within a country that has been more developed. So as a religion evolved with a country and a culture and the things going on with that country, if you could take a litmus test of the overall, the religions will usually, as of recent, in the more peaceful and higher rate of happiness and everything else, the studies that they do in those countries, the religions have tended to be far less following like all these traditions of doing specific things, and it becomes more philosophical and foundationally elemental as far as focusing on more philosophical ideas like love and selflessness and
connecting
love
yourself
being
to that deity. And
Right. It minimizes down to less of a narrative driven thing and becomes more philosophical and metaphysical, which has been what I've experienced in my own life anyway. So I might just be laying this on and trying to see it where it's not. I don't know, but I interacted with a guy that worked at Mosier, Thomas Mosier, who was from Jamaica, and he was a really good craftsman, making all these, more minimalist kind of structure, or pieces of furniture at Mosier. They're kind of craftsman and minimalist at the same time. But the things that he'd create himself at night were far more like the connections of how these things went together were not as much the issue as much as the ornamentation that he would carve into the pieces. Whereas at work and the Mosier stuff, it was more about the joinery and less about any ornamentation within the work. And so that similarity, and also if you look at the development of Rome, they had all these coming out of the Greek culture and everything else, these very more rigid structures in stone and everything else. And at one point, I forget who it was, some architect of note somewhere in Rome, said, why don't we take this whole capital, or I'm losing my architectural terms over time here, but the piece that goes across the top of the columns on the front of the
cornice,
like the Parthenon or anything else, right? It was on the interior of a church, a small chapuletta or whatever they call it, I forgot. But they took that piece, which is always rigid and just straight, and it's turned into like an undulating ribbon.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time where they broke that that standard approach every time. And that's where they see the Baroque period starting, where things got way more kind of expressive beyond function. But it goes there, and then it comes back to this more refined thing, and then goes pretty crazy, and then comes back. And there's this ebb and flow, and I think it's mostly tied to the ebb and flow of cultures and this back and forth between literal kind of interpretations and refinement, and then over to this more experiential and expressive. And I think it goes back and forth just as a response to what we foundationally are made up of, people that can be much more oriented towards laws and consistency and conservative and rigid,
mm-hmm.
and then more people that are more open and flowing and progressive and kind of more to what's possible. So they break a cornice and make it weird, and that might work or it might not. And that's also kind of how biology works. It comes up with like this progressive mutation, and like it might work, but most of the time it doesn't,
It
so
may not.
it's this attempt and judgment, and then either accepting or rejecting. It's that back and forth, and it's always a risk to try something new as a designer, architect, person, anything. It's always a risk to try something new and very difficult. But if you can achieve it and it's accepted by the whole, you become, or your creation becomes something that's a new brick in the wall that we're building over eons. So,
and it's always super nerve-wracking to show clients something that may be a bit out of expectation. But I think what's really interesting about what you're saying, Trent, is like when I think about buildings and places and that I love the most, there are always things that like I want to put my hands on. Like I want to touch things. Like I want to trace my finger on something. I want to feel, how can a piece of stone look soft? Like how does that work? And it does, like
the stones in the Incan, those really perfectly rounded ones. To me, that's soft when it comes to stone.
Yeah, it's like how did that happen? And I want to touch that, right? And
just
so
feel that perfect curve coming between each stone. It's so weird.
Yeah, it's and so I want to look for ways of like include like, and what that tells me is like that I'm engaging with a building, right? I'm not just inhabiting it. I'm engaging with it, or I'm engaging that wall. I'm not just looking at it. It's not just holding up earth or keeping me out or doing so. Like you're engaging with it, and I'm really interested in this notion of beauty and ornament, not for gratuitous reasons of just like, I say like tarting something up, but to give me a reason and a desire to go over and touch something, to engage with it, to give the building a bit of life, so that it's it's also an active part in the experience. It's not just keeping the weather out. It's not just holding
Mm.
a wall for my sofa, but it's actually inspiring me and making me think, and making me kind of craving to engage with it. And that's for me is the
Yeah.
really interesting part.
So
And
have you there's a really incredible documentary called Listening to Kenny G.
no, but someone
It's on,
told me about this.
so good. It's on
Okay.
HBO Max.
Yeah.
They're not a sponsor of the podcast, unfortunately, but it's so good. I mean, it's like Kenny G is the most non-challenging music you could ever pick. That's why it's smooth, easy listening jazz, right? And it just burns the music critics. They hate it, but it like most of them hate it. But the public, you know, that's all stuck in their cubicles or anything else, or, you know, just trying to go to sleep. He's the most successful instrumental musician of all time. You know, so you can't argue with it. Like, there's a need for it, but it's not a challenging art form. And through the interviews with him, you kind of find out, like, he's not trying to challenge people or anything else. He's just creating what comes out of him. And you end up having a lot of respect, in my opinion, for the individual, while not, you know, appreciating his music at all. But also seeing the complexity in the people who are studying, like, the creativity of music and the history of music and the call and response of jazz. And like, you see all the complexity, but at the same time, you see people who just need some soothing sounds, and they just need to be able to go to sleep, you know?
Well, things can be beautiful for being beautiful, right? There doesn't
Right.
have to be any, I mean, it doesn't, you know, I have quite a few tattoos on my body, and one of the first ones I had was a number 5, and people always came up to me and said, well, what does the 5 mean? And I told one person what it meant, and they looked at me, they're like, huh.
It's from the movie Number 5 Alive back in the 80s, right?
It might be. I'm not going to tell you because I don't tell people anymore.
That's good.
Because I don't tell people anymore, because I realize that meaning is personal. It's not ubiquitous, right? What is meaningful to me may be completely trivial and stupid to someone else, but what is stupid and trivial to me has very deep meaning for other people. And so I try and look at things not with, like, I'm trying to do this because I'm my intention is this. Sometimes it's just because something feels good. It's because it looks beautiful. I had one of my most favorite architecture professors asked me one day why I did something on a project in his studio, and I was kind of like, and he said, it's okay sometimes to say because I liked it,
or it just felt right. You might not be able to articulate it, but you're responding to your experience.
And somehow I was expressing something, even if I don't know what it meant. And I think it's interesting because Kenny G could be just doing the same thing, right? Like he is putting out there something that is satisfying to him. I mean, and is pleasing. And whether someone who wants to like a critic who supposedly knows everything wants to agree with it or not. I mean, you can't always put a label or a grade on something and say this is good and this is bad. It can be beautiful just for the sake of being beautiful.
Right. That's so interesting. The whole like what you're saying as far as, like, why did you make a design choice? And you have to be so present in your own subjective experience as a designer, because I think you're responding to a problem with things you've experienced previously. And there's a lot of that is not articulate, that you're turning into an articulation, if that's the right word, of your experience solving a new problem. And there's this trial error in the schematic process, and also in the communication with the clients. And it's like everyone's experience in so many different ways is coming together to create this new creation. And when you hit it on the head, you know, those are like so odd how Frank Lloyd Wright came up with Falling Water, which is a different thing in many ways, because I think there was very little communication really between the clients and him, as much as he
it was
just
his
kind of
folly.
nailed something.
You know, he
Yeah.
like, and folly in my mind is a good word. Like he was creating art. Like
Yeah.
it transcended the client, right? I mean, it was
Right.
an expression, or it
Right.
is an expression. And it's
Yeah, that
emotional and it's intuitive. You know, clients often ask me why I did something, and sometimes I'm like, you know, because I just felt like it was the right thing to do, or that's what the response in my mind should be. There's no, I mean, you could respond to it in a very different way. Um,
hmm
Someone else would respond differently, but this is how, you know, my mind and my soul and my told me to respond.
right.
Um, and
I had very little understanding of art or the artistic process until I really started to question everything around me about 10 years ago. And to be able to start to understand that there is a very deep need and a very purposeful calling towards simply asking questions and
Mhm.
responding to your experience and questioning the things you don't understand, and like jumping on those things and actually like really struggling with them. Like there's a I think it's more of a Jewish interpretation in an Old Testament quote somewhere that's more of I think Israel means to wrestle with God,
Mhm.
which to me, I break that down as like, you know, your concept of God is a personal thing to every single individual, but to actually wrestle with that idea, not to just simply adapt what someone else has already said or, you know, a group is already acclimated to and accepts, but more so, what do you think God is, and what can you actually wrestle with that concept and produce something of meaningful, a
Exactly.
meaningful additive to life, or a deeper understanding, not to encapsulate the, well, God is this and you should because, and then you can't and you can. It
Right.
doesn't, that's more a reflection of culture and our experience over time, that we found certain things to be dangerous or risky and or beneficial or not. You know, I get that. But the call to actually wrestle with this experience of being alive and what it means, and how to respond to it, and how to grow it, progress it in a positive way. In my experience, you have to push for that progression, and you're always going to receive the pushback from the people who don't want the progression, but they're extremely valuable because they're the ones, in my opinion, that have a little bit more of a concept of the rigid form of reality,
Right.
who have to give you feedback on this wild idea that you're bringing to them. And
You
that's a
can't do
necessary
that.
part of it. Yeah. And if they need to be empowered to say, you can't do that, that's no good, while being honest to say at the same time, we cannot argue that that is not a good idea. You've done, you very open individual, you've made a very progressive thing, but you've made it work. And we cannot deny that this is a good thing. So we accept it. And
Yeah.
that's when you have the two sides, you know, the I don't know, Biden's and Trump kind of like, when you see the benefit on either side, like the conservatives and the liberals, you know, working together, that's when the best things come out. But when we keep kind of separating it out and thinking like you don't need the other side, it just, it pulls it
Well,
apart and it becomes ugly.
you know, tradition is is an important thing. I do believe, like in tradition and history is a big part of our common experience as a you know uh, a species, right? Like,
Yeah.
but we're not but we're not stagnant. We are not, and we are not. You know, you can look at organisms on life whose processes are exactly the same regardless of the individual, because that furthers their species, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cicadas, right? Like cicadas have a very short lifespan. They all pretty much go through the exact same process, and that keeps their species alive. But humans are very different, right? And our experiences are so different. But I do think it's important, and this is why, like, I was talking to a kid who a colleague of mine who's thinking about going to architecture school. And I said, yeah, and make sure you study architectural history, because it's important to know where you're coming from before you can know where you want to go, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
you have to, and I think it's the same thing you're talking about with religion. It's like it's good to understand it and to know the history of it, but it's also good to then take that and figure out what that means to you, because what it means to you is very different than what it means to someone else. And God may be something very different for you than it is for someone else. And
Right.
and that can't do anything but enrich your life if you just understand more about your own thoughts. And that's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. In accepting that there is some or a lot or little truth in belief systems, belief systems are a filter of the things that are good to do and the things that you should filter out doing in your life over time.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not the end all. They're not exact. They're not frozen in time. Nothing. Some people want them to be that way, and they're called highly conservative people. And then there's other religions that are extremely metaphysical and less that way, and those are more open religions, and people can be wishy and washy one way or the other. But the combination of those is simply that, like, this is a filter over time. These are traditions that we have found to be valuable. Mm-hmm. But if they become sacred, like this is a quote from that Kenny G thing documentary, that as soon as you make an art form sacred, it loses its value. Because if it's sacred, what you're saying is it's outside of any progression. This is perfect. We shall not, cannot challenge, cannot grow it, cannot mess around or play with it. That's the whole thing that jazz was just this, like, I'm just going to express, and there's this call and response. It seems that way to me from my limited understanding.
You might even be limiting that topic, whether it's music or religion. If you make it sacred and unchallengeable,
right,
you may be limiting more potential that it could offer, right?
Of course.
By fixing it in a place, you take away any ability to have it grow or to inspire. If it's just one thing, you've kind of killed its soul in some ways, I think.
Right. You kind of take life out of it, this ability to relate, grow, and exchange ideas and change. Yeah. And it's always the idea that someone who has a high amount of affection for something like jazz or anything else, they can make the mistake of making it sacred. And you kind of don't understand how much you're killing something when you do that sometimes. So
it's so funny. It's like it's the age old thing where, like, a parent tells their kid that their music is terrible, right?
Right. Every parent will say that to every child.
Right. It's that same thing. And then we music changes and so.
I mean, if you imagine adults in the late 60s looking at kids and they're like, what are you doing? And then you look at the adults that came out of the 60s into the 80s, what are you doing? And then now we're looking at millennials like, what are you doing?
Yeah, exactly.
It's all the same thing. Every cycle we're progressing, and we're resisting change, and we're pushing change, just as we should. We should resist change. That's and right. We should push change. If we didn't resist anything, every single idea coming into fruition and being accepted would be chaos.
Change should be hard.
You have to have, I kept beating my head against that wall with the religion that I was previously part of. And it's at some point I realized it's okay. I don't have to be part of this more highly conservative form. That works well for the people that gravitate towards that. I don't have to break that down. I just need to say my piece if I'm going to be a part of it, or just politely disengage. But it's also as it should be. Change should not be easy. If it were easy, it probably wouldn't be worth that much.
I was going to say it would be hard
and
to
maybe
find
be incorrect.
Yeah.
You need that filter of judgment from a different perspective. So, David, I feel like we have kept you for quite some time at this point, and I know you have guests and everything else there. Was there anything else you wanted to say or get to, or thoughts you had coming up before I take most of your morning?
No, I was like I said, I was kind of nervous about where this was going to go, but I mean, it was interesting that the conversation veered into areas that I've been pondering a lot on my own, just about notions of meaning and beauty and So I really appreciate that. I thank you for letting me be a part of this.
Well, I knew it'd be a great conversation with you because I've photographed your house. I've experienced a lot of spaces that you've been involved with, and I can usually tell immediately when I see something if you were involved in it, which is interesting. It has this feel to it, like, oh, I bet David was involved with this, and it turns out, oh yeah, David was involved. So it's kind of a neat thing. The other thing I wanted to say I probably a few months ago I had this more vivid realization of how to materially connect truth and beauty, and I haven't really developed an articulate statement on it, but it became far more obvious within the myriad of all the points of interaction and conflict and failure within your experience, and the things that come out that are tried and true that stand the test of time are always they kind of result in this beautiful thing, like every time. And it's a really interesting thing to get closer to being able to consistently articulate something like that, to be able to hand it over culturally, to be able to say, no, this is really important, that we don't proceed with this as being done until we feel that it's beautiful, both from a progressive and conservative side or anything else.
I love that. I mean, I really, I mean, to me, I find that to be a really inspiring statement, that there is a notion that beauty plays a role in helping us understand when we have, I don't know that we're ever finished, but like explored something and we're resulting in something true. Like,
right.
And I think that, in order to do that, you have to be willing to be acted upon. I think if we take it back to your first question, like we are who we are, and as bodies and as a planet because of eons of being acted upon. But I think the product of our work, we also have to be willing to be acted upon by outside forces and outside influences and things we feel, not just the way we want things to be. And I think you're right. Like if we allow that to happen and we allow things to act upon us and we question them and we push back and we accept some things and we disregard other things, then we will end up with something beautiful. And it may be very different than what we thought.
Right. And side note before we go, something you had said earlier, this idea of design responding to a place, right? And coming out of that, something that I've had in the back of my mind, because we just drove across the country and have spent a lot of time in a small slide-in truck camper with my family, 4 of us, 5 weeks, small space, and not a pleasing space. We eventually got to, where was it? Solvang, California. And I had come to my wits. I mean, we had put our dog Taco down. We went and visited my grandmother, and I wasn't able to hug or hold her or anything. And she had held me like all night, the first night of my life. And I have this connection with her emotionally that I wasn't even able to like talk to her except through a phone, through a sliding glass door, because we had Omicron like 2 weeks before and we were just being careful. There's this whole like emotional experience. And then we get to this Solvang just up the coast a bit. And I saw an Airstream dealer, and I went by the Airstream dealer and I was just like, I have to look at one of these. And they had a bunch of used ones and stuff. And long story short, we now are the owners of an Airstream because it's this space that's, it has a IKEA level of fit and finish. Like I get it. But as far as like trailers, you're not finding a nicer space. It's amazing,
It changes
and
things,
you get
right?
you get to drag that thing around with you wherever you want. So it's this different design. It's not responding to location. It's responding simply to a human being inside of it and resisting the elements of travel.
And
it's
needing
a different.
But they are beautiful. I mean,
incredibly.
There is a difference between an Airstream and other I don't know what the
travel
word is.
Travel. There's no comparison in my opinion.
And that feeds your soul, right? I mean, it's
oh, it's amazing.
What are you going to do with the one you drove out there with? And
already sold it. It's amazing. Like with COVID right now, that kind of stuff just sells like that.
Yeah.
I put it online, even being out here, there's way more people, but I put it online and it was sold in 4 days for more than I bought it for. So that's taken care of. And it's turned into actually potentially doing work with actual corporate Airstream now too. So that's
fun.
Super cool. Yeah. So we'll see if it comes to fruition or not, but that's an interesting conversation to go into some other time. The design of Airstreams, how did they approach that devoid of location restraints? It's this specific design for that different kind of experience.
They found beauty and the economy of space, which is a really hard thing to do.
Right. Yeah, and the reality of the traveling down a road and this like shifting all the time. Yeah. What materials respond to that, and then how do you make those materials beautiful? And the shape
responds to air as it's moving down the road. Yep. Right. I mean, there's all of these things that they probably know that we don't know, but it works, and we get to experience it as a user, and get to be the benefit of it.
Yep. So we're going to be setting it up as a Airbnb on our land eventually, so I can, have it pay for itself during the summer, and then we're going to use it in the winter. So if you and Justin want to get away down near Fortune's area,
well, be careful what you say.
You're welcome.
All right.
Cool. It's been really nice talking to you. Anything before we go?
I think I'm good. I appreciate you letting me talk.
Hey, it's been really enlightening. I love where the conversation went. Anytime we have one of these conversations and I come away feeling like I've clarified some ideas or heard some ideas that help clarify things that I'm like thinking over, is really good. So it's been fun. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. So, well, enjoy the rest of your trip, and we'll see you when you're back in Maine.
All right. Enjoy that warm weather out there. 50 degrees. Come on.
50 degrees. I know. I need to open a window. I'm starting to sweat a little bit in here.
Cool.
All right.
All right. Well, have a good day and a good weekend.
Thank you, Trent. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.